Hi, everyone. My name is Katherine Sanders from Sanders Consulting, and I'm doing this series of short interviews on the Surgeon General's framework for workplace well-being. And today I have the pleasure of talking with friend and colleague, Patrick Farrell, and I'll ask Pat to introduce himself.
Hey, well, as Kathy said, my name is Patrick Farrell. I've recently retired, but my history is recently was Provost at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. And before that, Provost for several years at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. My academic background is engineering, so I also taught engineering for 20 some years, both at UW-Madison and at Lehigh. And of course, have been quite interested in workplace well-being as throughout my career, but in particular as provost, where in some sense, having a healthy and productive and sustainable organization is one of the many responsibilities of a provost. So this has always been a topic of interest and hopefully some action throughout my career.
Thank you for clarifying that you see the well-being as part of the job as the leader. I think that's not necessarily always the case. And I find that I've always found that very impressive, having been one of your employees in the past. Um, so I'd like to actually share the Surgeon General's model on our screen here. And to start, just ask you, when you look at it, what does stand out for you?
Well, obviously, it's a really nice graphic. It's a way of encapsulating actually a lot of different things. So maybe what does stand out for me is kind of this graphical way of highlighting at least a handful of critical elements in kind of the health of workers. And it's interesting, I would say, that the centerpiece is worker voice and equity. I say interesting, important, but also interesting because, at least in my experience, that's not commonly the way most people think about the centerpiece, if you like, or the middle part of this whole topic of worker health. Depending on your background, you might approach this from a variety of different perspectives, but it's interesting to see the arrangement here where that is at the core of these other, maybe more specific topical areas.
I love it. You and I have actually given some talks about this model, about this framework. And I also am very struck by the worker voice and equity being in the center of it. I think it is compelling, especially as you see more unionizations happening across different sectors of society. And most recently, the unionization and strikes of some faculty in higher ed. And I guess I'm wondering, because of your expertise in academia, as a leader in academia, how do you see worker voice and equity in academia specifically?
Well, I think so I should maybe mention that the two institutions I spent all my time at, neither is faculty union. At Wisconsin, there's a teaching assistants union. So at least I'll just make that clear. Um, I think it's a very mixed bag at universities in the sense of worker voice. Again, worker, I think many faculty would take offense at that descriptor. They see themselves as largely independent contractors, significantly anyway. And to a certain extent, I don't, when I was provost, I didn't quarrel with that too much in the sense that we want creative people who will take the initiative and investigate what they think is important and do it in a way that is appropriate for their discipline and so on. So in some sense, they do have enormous flexibility. Um, times now we're in, I think, for many faculty, feel like there's some stepping back from that flexibility, which for many was an attraction to get into the field in the first place.
Hmm.
So I think it's kind of a, I wouldn't call it confusing time, but a changing time for faculty and kind of their own perception of what their responsibilities are. I need to add very quickly, though, depending on the size of university we're talking about, the faculty numbers may be dwarfed by numbers of staff, graduate students, and the many, many other people it takes to make a large institution run. And most of those folks don't have the kind of autonomy that faculty do, and their jobs tend to be or can be quite different. So it's like in many organizations, we have a wide variety of kinds of responsibilities, ability to sort of have some authority over what you do. Um, and I suspect that leads to, depending on the institution and your position within it, anything from reasonable satisfaction with the amount of voice and influence one might have on overall direction and important issues, to the feeling of being never listened to in a sort of in a class of workers that isn't nearly as privileged, and therefore often not even consulted. So I guess that's not a very good answer, because it's sort of all over the map, and also dependent somewhat on the personalities involved and the history of the institution. How eager are they to engage with groups of faculty, groups of staff in open conversation versus not? So I'm not sure in the end that's necessarily makes universities really all that different from a lot of other parts of the economy, where many workers might be feeling like they have less voice than they think they would like to have, or than perhaps might be good for the organization to have them have. And occasionally senior managers are a little bit afraid of allowing more of that voice to be heard.
I think that's a really good point, that at least when I worked for, I spent much of my career, as you know, in academia, and I was academic staff, not faculty. And most recently, I've been adjunct faculty, which is literally the independent contractor. But I think in most organizations, there are, I want to say, classes and a hierarchy of professionals and workers, and people forget that you can be in the same organization and feel pretty divorced from being able to influence what's going on around you, while someone else in the organization might feel that they have a lot of say in
Right.
what's going on, right? And
Right.
so those realities are living together every day.
Yeah. And of course, with varied awareness amongst the different individuals of everyone's not like me, or yeah, everyone very much is not like, there's not in my position, and I want to be aware of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I know one of the reasons I wanted to speak with you is that I know you've spent literally decades of your career implementing changes on organizations in these large academic structures to try to improve not only the health of employees, which is what I'm usually focused on, but also the overall health of the organization. And I'd love to ask you, just like, when you think about implementation. So, I mean, like, I think we're in agreement that this is a lovely framework. It's very attractive. And for people who have had a chance to read the report, it's actually very well researched, and I think a very hearty framework about what it takes for humans to be healthy at work. But what if we're going to try to actually do something with it and implement it, right? So that isn't something that the Surgeon General's office has provided a lot of support for, which is part of the reason I'm doing this series of short interviews. I know you have had a long focus on implementation, and I'd love to hear whatever comes up for you when you look at this model and you think about implementation. Where do you see like an inroad, or what have you done in the past, and how has that worked?
Well, let me start with kind of what I would say, sort of two, to me, overarching ideas, and then maybe say a little bit more about each of them. One is, as I look at the overall framework, there's almost too much here. I mean, it's great. There's lots of different topical areas to think about. Anyone who chooses to look at this could hone in on one or another that perhaps is a particular interest, but there's a lot. So let's say a senior leader who says, I would like to improve, the workplace health of my organization. I got to do all this stuff. I wouldn't say seems hopeless, but it seems almost unmanageable. So, which doesn't make it bad. It's just, there's that. The second thing I would say is kind of a starter is the header here again is sort of health in the workplace, or a healthy workplace. And that we can easily imagine that's a compartment of things to think about, which is really different from the compartment of things I think about on sort of fulfilling the mission of my institution, or even the more mundane, making sure the budget balances and all the other things. And it's sort of one of many competitors for time, energy, resources, and so on. And as such, if I compartmentalize that way, that's how it turns out. It's a competitor for time and energy, and bad luck, it may lose in that competition. For me, a much better way to think about it is to say it's not a competitor. If we can make it complementary or even totally aligned with some of those other things I mentioned about how we do what we do. In the case of a university, for example, our primary mission is education. We're trying to educate whoever comes to us. Sometimes we're educating ourselves in the research world, but that's what we do. So how is it when I think about integrating what's, for example, in that model into overall changes that might happen at university, thinking of it as a separate add-on activity? Oh yeah, another thing we got to have on our to-do list, to me makes it unlikely that we're going to make much progress. Not impossible, but unlikely.
So,
More
so
likely.
it's sort of like what you just did is gave everybody an extra task, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like,
Yep.
Here's this beautiful flowery stamp thing, go do this, but still do all the regular stuff.
And of course, if we're really smart, well, we all get together and say, oh, you know what? Let's have them people do that, whether it's HR or someone else. And we won't even think about it because they'll take care of it for us. We'll kind of ignore them, but somehow it will happen and we'll go back to our daily stuff and kind of ignore all that. Whatever. Yeah, exactly.
But
exactly.
I just want to say that is a typical approach, right? Oh,
Yeah.
we're going to create the office for workplace well-being, and it's going to sit separate from operations and finance and and so it, in theory, would be as important because it has an office.
Right.
But in practice, it becomes a competitor or
Right.
an add-on that isn't as powerful.
Right. And if you want to be slightly cynical for a minute, you could say, and the more sort of tasks we put on this kind of competitive list of things to do, the easier we make for people to ignore some of them, because they're smart enough to know you can't do all that stuff. All those things are not going to happen. So by deliberately putting too many things on my to-do list, you've given me permission to pick and choose the ones I want and the ones I don't want. Because if you only had two things, I can't really pick. I kind of got to do them. When you got 10, we all know I'm not doing 10. I might do 4. So I'll pick the 4 I like. So we all get that's the message, is pick the 4. And again, so to your point, right, we've kind of pretended we're going to make action or make progress in this, but realistically, we all kind of know, yeah, probably not.
Well, and we kind of insulate, I want to say, the core business functions, and I'm using air quotes for anyone who's listening and not watching, but the core business functions are insulated and can continue to run as they've always run,
right,
regardless of what's running outside of them.
Right. So the converse, which to me is kind of at least what I've tried to do in initiating or supporting change in the various roles I've had, is to say, are there ways that we can, not artificially, but authentically integrate some of these ideas into things that are either ideally already embedded in everybody's belief of what's really, really important for us to continue to do? That's the best, because I don't have to convince anybody of the importance of the activity. I may just have to say, there's an element of that activity that we all are really dedicated to doing that incorporates this sense of how do we make this a sustainable activity over time? How do we make it something that people aren't going to burn themselves out in 5 years doing? How do we make it something that feels attractive to newcomers who might be considering joining us and aren't going to turn up their nose and say, oh, I'm not with that place. So at any rate, to me, that's kind of, and it may sound a little bit like we're kind of trying to find flowery language for difficult tasks. That's not the way I see it. The way I see it is we're trying to, in some sense, push ourselves a little bit to perhaps think more broadly about those core activities which we all agree are really important for the missions we've set for ourselves, and acknowledge that there's a little bit more to that core mission than just a very narrow definition of, if again, in our own example, if we say it's education, so the only thing that matters is what goes on in a 50 or 75-minute class in a classroom. And most people would say, oh no, there's much more to learning, to education than that piece. That's an important piece, but there's much more to that. Exactly. And there's much more to education than just sort of what goes on even in the classroom building or in the lives of students. So at any rate, to me, that's a critical part of sort of getting the whole idea underway. And I would say the second part of then is how can leaders and others make this doable in the sense that even though we talked a little bit earlier about sort of adding extra jobs to people who already got plenty to do, even in the context I described, to some people, it does sound like I've just added an extra job. I used to get to think about only this narrow view of our mission, and now you're asking me to expand my perspective a little bit beyond what perhaps I used to have. That sounds like work. Okay, well, right, it is a little bit of work. There's no denying that. So how do we make that not just possible, but hopefully attractive for people to say, okay, that's something I want to do. That's really cool. Things are happening to enable me to do this in a way that's not going to drive me crazy. It's not going to mean I got to go home an hour and a half later than I do now, or whatever it is. It's going to make my current job impossible. But it's going to, and I think that's, again, a challenge for leadership, is to almost mentally model this going forward to say, if we propose this, if we get people excited about it, how is this going to play out in a way that, it not only kind of engages people the way we hope it will, but also helps them kind of in the doing make their own work and workplaces healthier. Now that kind of modeling ahead of time isn't always accurate. What I might imagine people will say could be wrong. But in my view, that's really worth doing. It's sort of in some sense, strategizing about strategy, is to say, what might happen if we did this? What might happen if we did this differently? What might happen if we talked about it this way? What might happen if we perhaps proposed a different kind of approach?
So are you,
in part,
if
go
I
ahead,
understand,
sorry.
I just want to see if I'm understanding. So the idea would be, before you as a leader plop that lovely graphic down and tell everybody we're doing it, you have to sit back and think, how am I going to integrate this into regular business operations? And how am I going to support that integration? And to link to your earlier comments, I wonder, do you then also think about what are the things I can take off of people's list of to-dos while we're doing this? It is extra work, right? It's going to be extra work, but how can I redirect then the energy and the capacity that we have into this integration process until it becomes the new normal? Is that
And
right?
of course, right, yeah. And one of the best ways to do that, of course, is ask people. And here it requires a little bit of willingness, because on occasion, well, this doesn't always end up well for you as the leader, but we'll get to that in a minute. Ask people. So, we're getting excited about this particular aspect of increasing, wellness amongst in a group of our in part of our organization. Is this something that you all would, some group you'd be excited to sort of see happen? Would you be, kind of, can you see or not how this might work well with the things you already do? And what do you think you'd need to make this happen. Again, with the constraints we just said, that I'm not trying to make you work longer hours. I'm not doing this work harder with less sort of stuff. But this seems like an opportunity for us to sort of do what we do in a way that's better than what we have. And I'd like you to, can we chat about this a little bit and sort of see if we can figure out how might this happen in a way that is productive for all of us, doesn't feel like it's, as you say, sort of an overload of activity. And if that means that one of the feedback says, well, the couple of things that we currently do now that we probably wouldn't be able to do. And okay, let's think about, do those things need to happen? Can we do them some other way? Anyway, so to me, one of the best ways to find out, of course, is to ask people.
So is
And
that, so I'm going to say, then I'm going to full circle back. Worker voice and equity, is that your starting place then?
yeah. So but in many respects, I guess this may not come out quite right. I feel like the best conversations around that are typically when there's a kind of a relatively specific topic on the table. So if we talk in the abstract about worker voice and equity, it might be an interesting conversation, but it's probably not going to give us much guidance into say, well, what might we do in our organization that will make it better than it was last week? If there's 50 people, we'll get 75 different possible directions to go. All of them good, but that's not very helpful to sort of figure out how, what collectively could we focus our energy on. To me, a lot more productive is if, given obviously general feedback from the organization, if here's an area we think really could use some work. And if someone like me can say, I heard that, this is really interesting to me as well. I have a few ideas to start with. What do you all have? How can we get from, okay, that sounds interesting, to some things we'd really like to do that might actually, work out in practice? And sort of, yes, so to me that worker voice now becomes really important, partly to help choose what it is we should like to focus our energies on, partly, of course, to help clarify, here's things that we, workers, if you like, would like to spend their time and energy on and feel like it is worthwhile. And frankly, here's some things that we don't think is particularly worthwhile or is less worthwhile. And perhaps we could be ordered to participate in, but given the choice, that's not what we choose. That's really helpful and constructive, I think, as part of the overall process of figuring out, well, where do we focus our time and energy?
So, for example, many organizations, including higher ed organizations, give annual climate surveys to their people to try to find out about engagement levels, and they're tangentially related to this graphic, right?
Mhm.
And so in theory, they could be used to identify trouble spots where you could come afterward, right, with more information like this graphic and the research that supports it, and start this conversation with the people who have identified there's a problem. Yes?
Right. Yeah. So I agree. To me, that's, at least in my experience, the kind of one of the valuable things about such surveys is always, I don't mean as negative, I'm not a survey expert, take the results with a bit of a grain of salt. On the other hand, it's a useful way to at least help, amongst the many issues that people could be concerned about, to be able to sort of figure out, well, what are the ones that come up the most frequently? These are clearly top of mind for people. It may be the way the questions were worded that we're sort of suggesting solutions that aren't useful or whatever. But anyway, it's a great way, in my view, to figure out at that first level, what are things that under these circumstances that were top of mind, and then follow up to say, here's what I heard in the survey. Can we focus our attention on kind of the one or two things that seem to come up most frequently? And let's see what it is possible for us to do in a constructive way that really starts to address some of the underlying concerns that seem to be kind of surfaced in the survey. So yes, definitely using the survey results as a helpful way to kind of focus in on topics. But at least in my view, and perhaps I don't, again, mean to be biased against surveys, that's not sufficient to really figure out how collectively do we want to move forward. It's a great way to figure out what's the topic of conversation. But then I think we've got to have those conversations.
If I might ask you in our last few minutes, do you have any other guidance or resources that you would recommend or that you've used that support workplace well-being, or how you've approached it in the past?
Well, as you might be able to tell from the way I've talked about this, I see this as part of kind of a bigger picture of change and change in organizations, and not change for change's sake, but to sort of say, can we try to understand as best we can what's going to make our organizations healthier and better at doing the things we have said we want to do, whatever our mission is that we've chosen. What's going to make us better at doing that over time? And almost always that involves some kind of change process, which is difficult, complicated, sometimes way slower than we want. But to me, that's the focus is how do we, and I'd love it if my organization felt this way, that we're always moving towards making ourselves better. Sometimes a little slower than we'd like. Maybe sometimes we go fast. Um, but our expectation is we're always moving. We're always looking for opportunities and finding them in ways to do what we do better. So yeah, those are the kinds of things. And so I tend to look at the larger scale change literature, some of which is very useful in thinking about how do we visualize and talk about and get feedback and be flexible around change. Those are the kinds of things that I think I find most valuable.
I was kind of hoping you would talk about building change capacity, because
Ah,
I know that you've focused on that because I've taught workshops with you about that topic. So, I mean, I know you have a Ready for Changing graphic, and I was kind of hoping that you would share it with people here,
sure.
and talk a
So
little bit about what it means to build the capacity to be able to do these things so that they're not just one-offs and unconnected.
sure. Well, so I just sort of show you a graphic that I have. It'll come up here. Um, uh, See if I can share my screen and just come up.
Yeah, here we go.
Okay,
Yeah.
so this is a website that I use, and this notion of ready for changing really encapsulate a lot of what Catherine was just talking about. Is one of the elements of change that is to be a constant is thinking about how your organization can be always building what I call change capacity. And what I mean by that is sort of the ability to think of itself as a flexible place, to think of itself as a forward-looking place that, as I mentioned a minute ago, is sort of always looking at ways, big and small, to make our organization better at doing the things we all want to do and achieving the things we want to achieve. And the change capacity idea is one that says, well, in addition to sort of the visible changes we might see, can we continually work towards making ourselves better prepared for the next change that might come, some that we might expect, some that will be a surprise. And so a lot of the things that I tend to talk about, and you'll see here is a program we've run in the past, is about change, but also about what can we do to help my organization also become better at change and become more prepared for changes, whether, as I say, they are expected or unexpected. And that notion of change capacity, frankly, in my experience, now is almost a self-fulfilling notion, in that organizations that feel like they're more capable of change will tend to be more assertive and take on more ambitious change. And when they show success with those, they're ready to take on yet more ambitious change.
Well, and
And
if you,
that's
oh,
okay.
I
Sorry, go
just
ahead.
want to link it explicitly to health. If you're unhealthy, if the organization is unhealthy or the people are unhealthy, they have reduced capacity. That's just part of
Correct.
not being healthy, is you can't function at your peak capacity. So building capacity, building change capacity is literally building the health of the people and the organization.
Exactly. And it may also, hopefully, I would like to think, encourage people, this notion of building change capacity also might suggest that if my organization isn't ready, or I don't think they were able today to sort of turn into the healthy workplace that I'd like them to be, okay, disappointing. On the other hand, it might say, well, what can I do, or my group do, or my piece of the organization do that increases our change capacity, so we start to make those changes, even at a modest scale, and in the process, we're helping us all to learn about what's it going to take to make the next bigger change, and perhaps the next bigger one beyond that. So while it may be discouraging in some cases to feel how far away from the ideal organization my place actually is, and I totally appreciate the frustration of that, I hope that a little bit of that is to say, and yet there's probably an opportunity to begin to move. And hopefully that those opportunities grow over time, and at some point you begin to see the bigger movement you'd really like to see.
Perfect. Is there anything else you want to say about building change capacity? We're almost at time here, so.
It's I guess I would say the last thing I would say is it's building change capacity is something that I would encourage anyone to sort of see in others, appreciate, recognize. I wouldn't quite say reward, but often your people with the most change capacity, sometimes their leadership levels, sometimes aren't. And I would encourage anyone in an organization, particularly in leadership positions, to when you come across people who are helping you build change capacity, appreciate them, acknowledge them, elevate them, do what you can, because those people can both be rare and can themselves eventually get frustrated and burn out, and you want them active and engaged and building that across your organization. So find these people and appreciate what they do.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me about this. And I'll put a link to some of your information, including this webpage, underneath the video. So thank you so much,
Great.
Pat.
Well,
I
thank you.
appreciate it.
Fun to talk.